Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
When scientists study, for example, a particularly dangerous type of influenza virus, the knowledge they gain could lead to the production of a vaccine against that strain of influenza. This would be a great benefit for all of us. Their research could, however, at the very same time, also provide them with knowledge of how to turn the virus into a powerful biological weapon, a terrible risk. This is what scientists and politicians mean when they talk about dual-use research of concern. Research in the life sciences that has the potential for enormous benefits but comes with great risks. How can such research be conducted and regulated? That is the question at the heart of a symposium conducted by the Volkswagen Foundation in December 2014 in Hanover, Germany. The opening remarks were given by Harvey Fineberg. Fineberg was Dean of the Harvard School of Public Health and served as president of the Institute of Medicine in Washington. His main area of research is decision-making in medicine and public health. His talk has the title, Decisions about Gain-of-Function Research. Who bears the burden of proof? In his talk, Fineberg describes a recent fundamental shift in U.S. policy on dual-use research. In the summer of 2014, 3 lapses in biosafety became public: a potential exposure of lab employees to anthrax, the discovery of an unaccounted sample of the smallpox virus, and the accidental distribution of a particularly dangerous variant of the influenza virus to another lab. Fortunately, none of the events led to actual harm, but it caused the U.S. government, on October 17, 2014, to temporarily halt its funding for dual-use research on certain kinds of organisms. This decision, Fineberg argues, represents a fundamental shift. In the past, the burden of proof, whether research or the publication of research results, was too high a risk, lay with the regulating body, that is, mainly the government. The halting of funding turned this around. Now the researchers and the research institutions have the burden of proof to show that the benefits of going forward with their research outweigh the risks. In his talk, Fineberg lays out the challenges to reaching informed, sensible, acceptable, and appropriate solutions. He emphasizes that the words in which we frame the problems already influence the issues we raise and the answers we might give. Fineberg describes what a discussion about this kind of risk-benefit analysis could look like and who needs to be involved. He gave his talk in Hanover on December 10, 2014 at the Herrenhausen Symposium, Dual-Use Research on Microbes, Biosafety, Biosecurity, Responsibility. The symposium was organized by the Volkswagen Foundation.
In my opening remarks, I wanted to share with you a perspective on the current state of development in the debates about dual-use research or gain-of-function research or research with pathogens of pandemic potential, depending on how you describe the problem. Each of those descriptions, by the way, casts the problem in slightly different light and raises slightly different issues to the fore for consideration. But after reviewing briefly where we are at the moment in the United States, I want to touch upon 4 special issues of concern to me about how we will go about reaching sensible, informed, acceptable, and appropriate solutions to the problems that we are jointly facing. On October 17th of this year, the United States government announced that it was proceeding to enact a pause in funding for research dealing with gain-of-function related to 3 organisms: influenza, the coronavirus of SARS, and the coronavirus of MERS. That decision was accompanied by a description of a process that would be undertaken in the United States to attempt to resolve unanswered questions about the means by which one could go forward in this research. Specifically, the announcement charged a group called the NSABB, the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity in the United States, to make formal recommendations in the course of time about the policy and practice that should be pursued. And in association with that mandate to the NSABB, the government said that it would authorize a parallel process in the national academies under the aegis of the National Research Council, which was to bring together experts and the public to discuss elements of benefit and risk, and specifically to advise on how to proceed with what is called a, quote, objective and rigorous, unquote, examination of the benefits and risks associated with this research. Now, this announcement came as a departure from what had been the established policy dating back to 2012, in which the US announced that it would take 15 agents of special concern, organisms or toxins, and 7 classes of experiment of particular concern, most of which deal with gain of function of one type or another, or ability to evade detection or treatment on the part of the organism. And it applied a special standard to proceeding with that research, premised on the idea that the institution and the scientists conducting the research would bring forward these concerns prior to proceeding with the research. Now, why did the United States make this change from a policy which essentially said research goes forward with exceptions to when it may come under the umbrella of these special concerns, to a policy which says we are pausing on our funding and we will only proceed with this research under conditions that have been more fully assessed for benefit and risk. Essentially, what happened is that in June of this year, there were 3 reported episodes of different kinds of breaks in biosafety, all related to work at the CDC or the National Institutes of Health. One of these involved exposure to anthrax, potentially, of a number of employees. One of these involved the discovery in an abandoned laboratory of smallpox virus that no one had kept track of. And one of them involved the distribution, inadvertently, of a more dangerous variant of influenza virus that fortuitously was sent to another BL3 laboratory and not more widely, and therefore did not create any undue harm except for the fact that it should never have been dispatched in the first place. And these 3 episodes, coming one after another, reawakened concerns about biosafety as well as biosecurity, and had a direct connection to the decision to declare a pause in funding. Now, we have experienced in the past self-imposed moratoria by the scientific community, which have come and been then preceded by active research. But this pause is imposed by the funder, by the government in the United States, and it has stated a procedure and a practice by which it will revisit this question. And what this represents to me is a very substantial change in where the responsibility and burden of proof rests. In the past, if you think back even to those first experiments and the question about publication, the responsibility and the burden of proof was on the NSABB and others who would want to demonstrate why this research should not be fully disclosed. And in fact, in the course of time, as everyone here is well aware, the research was fully disclosed after some back and forth. But now, the responsibility and the burden has shifted to the other side, because the default condition at the present is that this research is not going forward, and in the US context will not go forward unless and until the conditions of the balance of benefit and risk have been resolved. I hope and I expect that in the course of these several days, we will expose many of the same kinds of questions, considerations, and arguments that need to be incorporated into those deliberations, as well as deliberations that are going on here in Germany, in other parts of Europe, and indeed around the world. And that is why one of the reasons I believe this gathering has so much timely salience. Immediately after this, as has been alluded, a gathering will take place in Washington, the first of the meetings of the National Research Council called to play its part in the US process. And this brings me to the first of 4 challenges that I want to set forth. How can we establish and implement a deliberative process that is appropriate, inclusive, and fair in reaching determinations of how to go forward with this research, under what conditions, and in what ways? There are many relevant and appropriate participants in these discussions. They include, of course, the scientists who conduct research on gain of function and closely related scientific research. They also include the larger scientific community and professional societies. They certainly include the institutions that house, support, and sponsor this research. They include the funding agencies, whether public or private, who would undertake to fund this research. They include regulatory bodies at different levels in governments who have a responsibility for public safety. They include political leaders who oversee all of the processes that we're discussing. And very importantly, they include the public at large, because decisions that are taken about risk and benefit balance that have not adequately incorporated the views, understanding, and agreement of the larger body politic are going to have problems going forward. How do we have a process that gives voice, adequate communication, and appropriate weight to each of these participants? How far can a process such as we will hear more about later, of voluntary scientific governance and standards, take us toward this goal? And what is the way that we can bring relevant representatives of the public into this discussion? That is one of the big challenges that we are going to be facing and needing to be resolved. The second problem, and a big challenge that I want to touch upon, relates to the idea of conducting a formal analysis of benefits and risks. These are problematic in any field, but they have some special requirements and difficulties in connection with these issues. Objective and rigorous are terms that have to confront a reality that is intrinsically, at least in part, subjective and highly uncertain. So let me touch upon 3 different aspects of this subjectivity and uncertainty that impinge on the question. First, as is evident to anyone who has followed the debate and participated in it, there are many different perspectives and value systems that each of us brings when we enter this discussion. In general, my observation is that many scientific colleagues tend to attribute differences in view to a lack of knowledge or understanding on the part of those who do not see the question in the same way as they do. This may be the case, but it may also be that equally well-informed, thoroughly knowledgeable, and engaged individuals bring different values, different preferences, and different weights to the different concerns that apply to the safety, security, and benefits of scientific knowledge. Secondly, there is a difference between objective measures and the psychological weight or impact of these measures, which is especially important when we are talking about a set of decisions which ultimately play out in the public arena. For example, when it comes to uncertain future effects, many people conflate probability and magnitude of the effect. In other words, it's not easy to separate the likelihood something will occur from the severity of that occurrence if it should occur. And from an objective point of view, we ideally would separate the magnitude, the importance, the scope in terms of numbers of people and geographic areas that may be affected, the time horizon of when an effect, good or bad, takes effect and how long it lasts, and the likelihood that that effect will occur, whether positive or negative. And it's very difficult to keep these separate and in perspective. A second problem is frequently referred to as framing effect. And this is developed in the classic works of Kahneman and Tversky and their colleagues, looking at the psychology of how we think about gains and losses, and we do not see them psychologically as symmetrical. Let me illustrate with a classic problem from one of the early papers of Kahneman and Tversky, and I think you will understand the point. Suppose I were to tell you that 600 people are at risk of dying from a disease, and you have two options. Option one is that you can apply a treatment where 200 will certainly live. Option two is that you can apply a treatment which has a 1/3 probability that all will live and a 2/3 probability that none will live. Can you follow that question? Option one, 200 will live. Option two, probability 1/3 that everyone lives and 2/3 that none will live. Okay. How many would prefer option one, to take the 200 for sure? And how many would prefer option two? I would say it's about, in this group, 60-40, 65-35 in favor of option one. Now, I want you to put this out of your mind, because I'm going to pose another problem, and I want you to forget the first. Here's the second problem. 600 people are at risk of dying. You have two choices. Option one is that 400 will die for certain. Option two is that there's a 1/3 probability that none will die and a 2/3 probability that all will die. 400 will die, option 1. Option 2, 1/3 probability that none will die, 2/3 probability all will die. How many would prefer to let the 400 die for sure? How many would prefer to take a chance and do the bet? Okay, now a vast majority here would prefer the bet, 1/3, 2/3. Do you see that these problems are actually identical? That 200 living is the same as 400 dying? That 1/3 probability that all will live is the same as a 1/3 probability none will die? I have done this example dozens of times, and I still, knowing what I know, that these are exactly the same, not only in expected value, which is true for each 1 and 2, but they are identical between the two cases. And yet, in this audience, and even I, inclined as I am, hearing it framed as living, keep the sure thing of the 200 alive, but hearing it framed as 400 dying, am willing to take a chance, even if it's only 1/3, that I could save all of them. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that most people are more willing to accept a risk if it avoids a loss than to accept the same risk in order to preserve a gain. You're resetting your psychology in how you think about the problem. Now, this is one reason why, if you are an advocate for this research, what you want to do is to talk about the risks of failing to conduct the research, because people will be more willing to allow and accept the risks, whatever they may be, with the research if they're going to avoid the risk of failing to conduct the research. And if you're an advocate for restraint or to curtail the research, then you should be content to emphasize the risk of doing the research. Now, this is going to be a very complicated problem when it comes to the persuasion and communication of the public. But there's one more effect that I want to say is also relevant here, and it's what we call the attribution effect, which is, in general, people are more accepting of a bad outcome if it arises from natural sources than to accept the same bad outcome that arises from human action. So let me give you an example. So take that same 600 people, and I tell you an infection is coming that will kill 1/3, but there's a vaccine that is perfectly protective. The problem is that the vaccine kills 1 in 6. The disease is coming, it will kill 1 in 3. The vaccine, perfectly protective, but kills 1 in 6. How many would use the vaccine? How many would not use that vaccine? About 1/3 of us would not use the vaccine. Most of us would. But you could see I could make the vaccine 25% deaths, and then fewer would use the vaccine. Or 30% against 33, and then practically none of us, I would guess, would use the vaccine. Think for a moment, though, if the numbers were reversed. The disease kills 1 in 6 and the vaccine kills 1 in 3. Well, then nobody is going to use that vaccine, and it's an easy choice. Why is it a hard choice when the vaccine kills fewer than the disease, but an easy choice if the disease is going to kill more than the vaccine? One reason is that natural causes are more acceptable as harms than something that we do. And here, it's very relevant to the fact that people feel differently about an infection from the wild than an infection that escapes from a human laboratory. So these are some samples of that second problem of making objective what is intrinsically subjective and psychological. A third problem is refining policy so that it's targeted appropriately to the particular organisms and types of research. Lumping all the organisms and treating all types of gain-of-function research in the same broad sweep is unlikely to give the refinement that is necessary in thinking concretely and appropriately about the most appropriate responses. And finally, these discussions are going on in countries around the world. They're going on in Canada. They're going on in the Netherlands. They're going on in the United States. They're going on to a degree in Germany now. But this is not a national problem. This is a global problem. And somehow we have to find a way to establish global standards, global understanding, global procedures that will provide a regime that is satisfactory for science and for the public interest in every country. And it's going to be, I think, a very, very important part of this debate, how far self-regulation of science and the scientific community can take us toward that goal. Thank you all very much.